nobody taught me this. Nobody gave me a toolkit to say, hey, you're going to feel lots of really hard things inside of your body. You're going to have stories constantly telling you you're an imposter, you're not good enough in your head. Here's some ways to think about navigating life despite or in spite of all of that. And then here's a toolkit that will help you minimize and be kind of as effective as you can be when you're taking on all that adversity. I didn't get that. And I'm learning that not a lot of students, athletes, or businesses, yeah, professionals understand that. And so I started to articulate, right? What is it? And for me, a great roadmap, I believe we all need one, and it's got to be simple. And for me in my mind, I said, you know what? There's this thing that I think of as the deep end where I'm like choosing to go after something, and it's the hardest thing I ever did. I'm like just trying to keep my head above water. But when I look back on it, I wouldn't trade that experience. I wouldn't trade that chapter for the world, right? I learned so much. I grew so much. And so for me, I now have this simple heuristic: go and find the deep end. Find a deep end worth jumping in and staying in for as long as you can. And here's what the deep end means, right? You don't need to take this language. Language is important, but if there's a word or a concept that resonates more, the simple idea is that it is a state where we are pursuing an audacious goal. We're aspiring towards something. It's driven by an intrinsic drive. So it's not the money, the status, what we think other people think of us. Those are all extrinsic factors. They can be a part of the equation, but they can't be the driver. It has to be intrinsic. You need that inner fire. Otherwise, it won't stay lit long enough. You won't be able to survive. We know, I mean, entrepreneurs is the best room to do it. We're going to be taking on risk, uncertainty, fear of failure, imposter syndrome. We kind of need to know that those things are coming, and we need tools to be able to navigate and persevere through that. And then finally, we're going to be hit by the biggest walls in our life. That red line on the screen there is, I call it the wall. It is the adversity, the challenge that breaks you, and you better have a great group around you, right? Your tribe to build you back up. Now, I'm going to pause in a second here, but I know I'm not painting a very rosy picture of the deep end. So the next question is like, well, why? Why should we try and think about what this looks like for in our life? And the reason is because I believe for all of us, when we find ourselves in these environments and we're willing to summon that courage to put ourselves here, we earn some of the most valuable things in life. The opportunity to have our greatest moments of flow and impact, peak performance, right? We build mastery, which I know for a lot of us, if we think about our life's work, we have to spend time doing what we love and refining those skills over long periods of time. You don't get that in the comfort zone. You don't get that in the sidelines. You got to be in the deep end. And then finally, the biggest thing, the most important thing that I've recognized through my life is that we gain and accumulate the potential to learn and grow when we spend time in the deep end, not when we're on the sidelines. And that's the difference between, whether we live a life of comfort and mediocrity, which I'm going to show in a second, or we choose to go and find those deep ends and jump into them and spend time there, is we have the opportunity to learn about ourselves at an accelerated rate relative to our peers. And that compounds over the long game of our life. So for me, I kind of think about this environment, whatever you want to call it, the deep end, is where I'm being pushed to my limits. I'm fighting to keep my head above water. But when I have those moments where I can take a breath, and I can gain a moment of clarity, which sometimes doesn't happen often, and we all know that, I pinch myself because I know there's nowhere else I would rather be. I wouldn't trade it. And I think that's really like the holy grail, the North Star that I try to navigate to in my life is those moments. That the deep end isn't actually the most important part of this idea of a roadmap. Because if the deep end was easy to get to, we'd all be there all the time. I wouldn't be having this conversation. And this topic of like, how do we navigate life wouldn't be as important. The last 10 years, I've been struggling and turning this question of how do we find it? How do we know that the leap that we're taking is right for us and that we can commit the next year, 5 years, 10 years of our lives invested in this thing that is going to stretch us beyond what we think is possible? How do we find our deep end? And that's really where I want to open up the whole roadmap, which is very simple, right? The best roadmaps are simple. My belief and what I've seen is that, we're generally moving between one of these four phases. As humans, we all are constantly being tricked back into the comfort zone. The most historic and oldest parts of our brain, our amygdala and our brainstem, are always trying to tell us, hey, don't go chase that thing. Don't take that risk on. You're safer here. But that's the biggest risk in the world, right? Because we are choosing to trade our time for the present feeling of comfort, the story, and we never get that time back. So we need to be really mindful of like not staying in the comfort zone because those walls grow. But to get out of the comfort zone, we've got to escape, right? We've got to get out. We've got to climb this really scary high dive. That's as we start thinking about goal setting and the things that we want to pursue, all the stories start coming up. Once we make it into the deep end, we need to have a great toolkit to persevere, which is what I'm going to talk about through the back half of this session. And then maybe one last point. We're not going to talk too much about the pause, but it's just simply this concept that we do not grow when we're fighting for our lives and pursuing those things in the deep end. We grow when we give ourselves the permission to pause. And it is the hardest thing to do, both because we live in this Western, hyper connected, technology addicted environment, and also because we're type A entrepreneurs. We want to keep pushing. But that permission to pause, which I'm going to talk about at the very end, is so important. That's where we build that foundation at the bottom. And by evolving and building that foundation, you get to go back to the comfort zone and the high dive and strive, pursue something greater. One thing about this roadmap that's really cool for those of us who have, teams that we're working with that have maybe kids that we're raising, the language is important. It's accessible. So I present this workshop to, grade threes and fours and fives, as well as to the, senior executives at the largest companies in the world. And the reason why it resonates is because it's archetypal, right? We're all trying to navigate. We're all trying to figure out how do we make those best decisions. And so thinking about what is my roadmap, what is my framework is really important. The last couple of steps here, and then I'm curious where everyone sits, is the phases are important, but what's more important is understanding how do we move effectively between them through every chapter of our life. And so up above, you can see there's these little actions. When you're in the comfort zone, you've got to escape. When you find yourself at the bottom of the high dive, you got to learn how to climb. That means rewiring our brains to understand fear and uncertainty. When you're in the deep end, we've got to endure. We need that toolkit. And when we're in the pause, really, usually it's permission. It's embracing it. It's knowing that I don't need to rush back and keep hustling and grinding. And so when we work with folks here at the Wellness Den, what's underneath each of these is this really robust set of landmarks. Again, think about that map book. You've got landmarks that you need to orient yourself in space. And so each phase, each step has these different tools that we can use. Our foundation and goal setting, right? Understanding how our brains work in neuroplasticity and understanding our relationship with fear. This idea that when we do the work to set really great goals and base them in our foundation, those feelings of imposter or stories of failure actually become the best guiding light to help us lead us up the high dive. There's nowhere else we should be. We need to get up there and jump off. We're going to talk about the toolkit for the deep end. And then the pause, I had this come up last week in a conversation. The pause is not just sitting on the couch, right? It's not just like taking a break. The pause is intentional. It is guided and structured reflection or inquiry. I think about it as like excavation. We're like peeling back the layers of all of the experiences that we went through. And sometimes there's some scary stuff down there, right? We hide and bury stuff deep down below, but that's where the learning exists. And so we kind of excavate all the learnings and experiences, and then we have to kind of articulate and reintegrate them into our foundation. So the pauses work, but it's not the type of work that we do in the high dive and the deep end.